There are places where the sea does not belong, and yet there it sits, heavy and grey and patient, covering a world that the living have almost entirely forgotten. Beneath the wave tops and the cold chop of open water, beneath the fishing grounds where trawlers make their slow, deliberate passes and gulls wheel and cry above the wake, the earth remembers things that no written record has preserved, things older than clay tablets and carved stone and the first tentative scratches of human meaning. The water holds its secrets the way that certain silences hold theirs, not with hostility, not with any deliberate intention to conceal, but simply by existing, by filling every available hollow, by pressing down on the past with a weight of cold and dark that most of us will never see and never think to question. There are signs, if you know where to look. Strange deposits hauled up in nets, arriving on deck trailing black sediment and a smell of deep time. The curve of a great tooth, dark and impossibly heavy, still warm from the friction of the trawl. A trace of peat, a fragment of ancient wood, a worked piece of bone that belongs to no living shore. Fishermen who work these waters long enough develop a particular look when they describe what comes up from the deepest sets, a look that mingles wonder with something harder to name, a recognition that the sea floor is not empty, that the dark down there is not the dark of nothing, but of something buried and waiting. What if the floor of the sea beneath the waters that divide England from Europe was not always a seafloor at all? What if it was, once, a landscape walked by human feet, a country where fires were lit against the cold and children were born into a world that no map has ever preserved, a country as real and as inhabited and as full of ordinary human days as any place now standing above the waterline? Stay with us now as we descend, slowly, gently, without urgency, into one of the deepest mysteries the modern world has ever begun to uncover. A world lost not to war or plague or the slow forgetting of empires, but to the sea itself, to the remorseless patience of rising water and the indifference of geological time. The North Sea is not, by most measures, a beautiful body of water. It is grey more often than it is blue, choppy more often than it is still, and the light above it in the northern winter has a quality of diluted pewter that neither warms nor particularly encourages. It smells of salt and diesel and fish, and the distant cold of the Norwegian deeps, and the sound it makes against the hull of a working vessel is a sound of persistence rather than of beauty. The trawlers that work the Brownbank grounds, that prominent ridge of sand and sediment lying roughly 16 to 30 metres below the surface of the southern North Sea, perhaps 90 kilometres out from the Norfolk coast, are sturdy, workmanlike vessels built for endurance rather than elegance. Their crews are practical people. They know the sea in the particular intimate way that comes only from years of long acquaintance. They know its moods and its currents, its seasons and its temperament, its tendency to offer and to withhold according to a logic that is not entirely opaque to those patient enough to learn it. And yet even practical people can be unsettled by what the sea insists on giving them, and the men and women who work the Brown Bank and the grounds around it have, over the long decades of their trade, been unsettled again and again by the strange traffic that rises from below. A tooth as long as a forearm still crusted with the dark sediment of some vanished bed. A splinter of tusk, curved and yellowed and heavier than it has any right to be. A piece of antler worked at one end, drilled through with a hole so evidently deliberate that no argument of chance or erosion can quite account for it. These are not the sorts of objects the sea is supposed to produce, and yet the sea produces them, again and again, and has been producing them for as long as men have dragged nets across the shallow banks of the southern North Sea. For most of the 20th century, these finds were treated as curiosities of a small and eccentric kind, souvenirs to be nailed above the door of a captain's cottage, or handed reluctantly to a bemused museum curator who had no clear idea what to do with them. There was a general awareness that the North Sea floor had once, in some vague and distant past, been dry land, but that awareness lived at the edges of scholarly attention, unformed and unarticulated, more a footnote in geology textbooks than a subject of dedicated study. The region was thought of, when it was thought of at all, as a corridor rather than a country, a strip of land that had allowed people and animals to walk between one habitable place and another, but never as a place worth reaching in its own right. It was the road, not the destination. It was the space between the important things, not an important thing itself. And so, for decade after decade, The bones and the antlers and the fragments of worked wood accumulated in cabinets and drawers and storerooms across the coasts of England, the Netherlands and Denmark, gathering dust and cataloguing numbers, waiting for someone to see them as something more than a scatter of oddities, that someone came at last in 1998. In that year, an archaeologist at the University of Exeter named Brian E. Coles published a paper in the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society under the modest and characteristically cautious title Doggerland, a Speculative Survey. The paper was not long by the standards of academic monographs, and it made no dramatic claims. It offered instead something quieter and in the end more transformative, a synthesis. Coles gathered together the scattered evidence that had been accumulating for a century and more. The dredged bones, the barbed points, the peat samples, the offshore borehole logs, the tentative bathymetric maps of a seafloor no one had ever thought to study for its own sake. She read the geology alongside the archaeology. She read the archaeology alongside what was then known of the Mesolithic peoples of northwestern Europe. And she did something that in retrospect seems obvious, and that at the time was quietly revolutionary. She gave the place a name. She called it Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank, that broad submerged sand bank in the southern North Sea which is the highest surviving remnant of the drowned plain, and which itself takes its name from the Doggers, the sturdy fishing boats of the 17th century Dutch fleet that had worked those grounds long before anyone suspected what lay beneath them. The name was a small act of linguistic homage, a way of stitching the vanished country to the maritime language that had grown up over its grave. But the naming, in the deepest sense, was the point. To name a thing is to insist that it exists. To name a thing is to lift it out of the undifferentiated fog of the possible, and to place it, however tentatively, on the shelf of the actual. Before 1998, the North Sea floor was a curiosity. After 1998, it was a country. It had a name, it had borders, however uncertain, and it had, for the first time in the history of the modern scholarship, a claim on the attention of archaeologists as a place in its own right. Coles argued, in a phrase that has been quoted ever since, that instead of focusing on the land as a bridge, one ought to focus on the land as a place to be. The distinction is small and it is enormous. A bridge is something you cross. A place to be is somewhere you live. A bridge has no fires and no children, no seasons and no burials, no local dialects and no remembered rivers. A place to be has all of these things, and the people who inhabit it do not think of themselves as inhabitants of a bridge. They think of themselves as being, quite simply, at home. And so, with a single reorientation of perspective, the whole silent expanse of seafloor between Britain and the continent was granted a kind of retrospective personhood. It became a landscape that had known its own weather, its own tides and its own migrations, its own long, slow accumulation of ordinary human days. The dredged antler point recovered by a trawler in 1931 near the Wash, that fragile, unassuming barbed weapon, worked from the tine of a red deer and dated to the Mesolithic, ceased to be an isolated oddity and became instead a reminder. It was, as Coles herself put it, evidence that the area of the present North Sea has been land in the past and land that people knew. Land that people knew. There is a weight in that phrase that repays slow attention. To say that a country existed is one kind of claim. To say that people knew it is another, quieter, more searching kind of claim. It implies familiarity. It implies names for places, and paths between them, and the accumulated memory of where the good hunting was in autumn, and where the ice made the crossing dangerous in early spring. It implies stories. It implies the whole invisible architecture of lived experience that turns a landscape into a homeland, and it insists that this architecture once stood, in its full and unrecoverable particularity, across a broad plain that is now the bed of a cold grey sea. Whether we can ever hope to reconstruct even the smallest fragment of that architecture is a separate question, and a harder one. But before any such reconstruction can be attempted, the country itself must first be granted permission to exist. That permission, in 1998, was quietly given, and once given, it could not be taken back. To understand what Doggerland was, however, it is not enough simply to invoke its name. One has to try, insofar as the evidence allows, to picture it. And the evidence, the accumulated bone record hauled up by generations of trawlers, together with the more recent sedimentary studies conducted by researchers working from cores and grabs, and increasingly detailed offshore surveys, allows us to picture a good deal. Not the fine grain perhaps, not the particular tree on the particular ridge above the particular bend in the river, but the broad shape of the country, its climate and its vegetation and its animal life comes into a kind of focus that would have astonished the antiquarians of a century ago. For much of the late Pleistocene, that long cold epoch that ran, in round numbers from roughly 100,000 to about 10,000 years ago, Doggerland was a mammoth steppe. The term is a technical one, but its meaning is close to intuition. It describes a cold, largely treeless grassland, sustained by dry continental air and a short, intense growing season, and rich enough in coarse greys and browse to support herds of very large animals. Similar landscapes stretched in that era across enormous swathes of Eurasia, from the fringes of the western Atlantic all the way to the plains of what is now Siberia and beyond, into the corridor of Beringia that once joined Asia to the Americas. Doggerland was the westernmost expression of that vast circumpolar biome. It was a land of open horizons, of grass moving in long slow waves under a hard sky, of rivers running clear over gravel beds and disappearing westward into the far Atlantic. It was a land where the wind, one imagines, was rarely still. The bone record confirms the picture and populates it. Trawlers working the North Sea grounds have brought up, over the decades, the remains of woolly mammoths in numbers so consistent that certain skippers, in certain seasons, could reasonably expect to see a tusk or a molar or a great curved rib rise from the net at least once in a working month. Woolly rhinoceros bones have surfaced from the same waters, along with the enormous jaws and canine teeth of cave lions, the great sweeping antlers of giant deer, the massive skulls of aurochs, those long extinct wild cattle whose descendants live on only in the domestic herds of the modern world, and the bones of horses small and hardy and adapted to steppe conditions. Straight-tusked elephants, warmer adapted cousins of the mammoth, also appear in the record from earlier and milder intervals. Radiocarbon dating on many of these specimens places them across a wide range of time, with a great many falling between roughly 40,000 and 15,000 years ago. What emerges from the pattern is not a single frozen snapshot of one moment in the past, but a long procession of shifting fauna adapted to shifting climate, all of it playing out across a landscape that persisted, in one form or another, for tens of thousands of years. And through that landscape ran rivers, enormous rivers, larger by far than any river that now empties into the North Sea from the modern coastlines of England or the Low Countries. When the sea stood at its lowest, during the coldest phases of the last glaciation, the great rivers of northwestern Europe did not empty into a shallow North Sea at all, because there was no shallow North Sea to empty into. They flowed instead across the exposed plain of Doggerland, joining and merging as they went, gathering the waters of what geologists now identify as the Paleo-Thames, the Paleo-Rhine, and the Paleo-Meuse into a single vast drainage that pushed westward across the plain and eventually spilled out into the deep Atlantic through the widening trough of what would later become the English Channel. Imagine, if you can, the scale of such a river. Imagine a floodplain wide enough to swallow whole counties, meandering across a treeless steppe under the cold clear light of a long northern afternoon. Imagine the herds of horse and reindeer moving along its terraces in seasonal migrations, and the great slow shapes of mammoth threading the low ground where the water braided across gravel bars. This was Doggerland at its coldest, and even at its coldest it was not a wasteland. It was, in the phrase used by the archaeologist Vincent Gaffney, not only a heartland of early human settlement, but also a refuge for plants and animals, a place where life persisted, and where, when the climate began at last to warm, life could expand outward from a landscape that had never entirely lost it. The warming, when it came, was not gentle. It was uneven, punctuated by cold reversals, and it worked itself out across the drowned country by increments and by shocks. But by roughly 16,000 years ago, according to recent studies of sedimentary ancient DNA, recovered from cores drilled into the modern seafloor, temperate woodlands were already establishing themselves across southern Doggerland, oak and elm and hazel, patchy at first, then thickening into groves and belts along the sheltered valleys and the warmer southern slopes. This is earlier than researchers had once assumed, and it complicates any simple picture of a sudden transition from tundra to forest. The country was more responsive than expected, more precocious in its recovery, more willing to grow trees the moment the climate would permit them. The mammoth steppe did not vanish overnight. The great herds retreated northward and dwindled by degrees. But behind them, on the warming ground, a different Doggerland began to take shape. A country of mixed woodland and open glade, of reedy marshes along the great rivers, of estuaries slowly filling with the first tentative fingers of the sea. There is a phrase that the archaeologist Reg Bell has used to describe a certain haunting stage of this transition, and it is worth pausing over. He speaks of a time when colossal oak trees would have stood, dead, through the salt marsh, the great trunks rising bleached and skeletal from the drowning ground, the salt already at their roots, but their old boles still standing, catching the wind, casting the long, strange shadows of a landscape caught between two states of being. It would have been, he says, a weird sort of landscape, and one can hear, in the plainness of that word, weird in its older sense, meaning strange in a way that touches on fate, something of the atmosphere of a country in the slow act of dying. The dead trees of the coming salt marsh are still, in one sense, in the future. In another sense, they are already implicit in the geography of the warming plain, waiting only for the rising sea to make them visible, but we run ahead of ourselves. Before there was a drowning, there was a country. And before the country could drown, it had first to be inhabited. The people came, as the trees came, from the south and the east. By at least 12,000 years ago, and probably a good deal earlier along certain favoured routes, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers were moving out onto the emerging lowland, following the herds of reindeer along the terraces of the great rivers, following the runs of salmon up into the tributaries and the clear water spawning beds. They were not, so far as we can tell, a numerous people. The Mesolithic communities of northwestern Europe were small, mobile and dispersed, organised around bands of a few dozen individuals who moved through the landscape according to the seasons and the availability of game. But they were also skilled, and they were persistent, and they carried with them a technology of astonishing subtlety, worked flint and bone, barbed points and fine microliths, harpoons and fish spears and the beginnings of true woodworking. They knew how to build shelters against the cold. They knew how to preserve meat and hides. They knew above all how to read the country they moved through, where the reeds gave good basketry, where the flint outcropped clean from the chalk, where the birds gathered in the shallow bays, and where the deer came down to drink at dawn. They left no cities. They did not build in stone. They did not till fields or lay out streets or leave behind the sorts of grand fixed monuments by which later civilizations announced themselves to the long future. And so, for a long time, it was easy to assume that they had left nothing at all, that Doggerland had drowned, if it had ever really been inhabited, without leaving any human trace worth speaking of. But this assumption, like so many of the assumptions that had once shrouded the drowned country, turns out to be simply wrong. The Mesolithic peoples of Doggerland left no cities, but they left themselves. They left, that is, the small hard fragments of their own lives, the tools their hands had shaped, and the bones their bodies had once worn, scattered across a landscape that the sea would eventually gather up and hold in its patient dark. Consider first the human mandible fragment dredged from the North Sea off the coast of the Netherlands, a piece of a human jaw, hauled up in a net alongside the more familiar burden of fish and shell and worn stone, and recognised for what it was by observers alert enough to see the shape of ourselves in a fragment that most people, at a glance, would have taken for the bone of some ordinary animal. To hold such a piece in the hand, if one were permitted to hold it, would be to hold a fragment of a person who died at least 7,000 years ago on ground that has not been ground for almost as long. It is the sort of object that resists ordinary description. It is at once utterly commonplace. Every human being who has ever lived has possessed a jaw, and utterly extraordinary in its provenance in the fact that it has come to us at all after so long a submergence, after so long a silence. Consider, second, the worked bone harpoons recovered from the Brownbank grounds, those same grounds where the trawlers still make their slow, deliberate passes, where the gulls still wheel and cry above the wake. These are not the tools of a casual passer-through. They are the tools of people who lived on, and by the rivers and estuaries of the drowned country, who fished its waters and hunted its shores, who returned again and again to the same productive stretches and left, on those stretches, the broken and discarded implements of a working life. The barbs are cut with care. The shafts are shaped with the patient attention of hands that had made such things many times before. They speak, in their small, stubborn way, of familiarity, of a landscape known and returned to and worked, not merely traversed. And consider, third, the perforated antler mattock recovered from the Lehman and Oa Bank, out on the seafloor of what is now the southern North Sea. A mattock is a heavy tool, used for digging and for working wood, and this one was made from antler and pierced through with a hole to receive a wooden haft. It is a sophisticated implement. It represents a considered decision to invest labour in a tool that would then be used to invest labour in something else, in the shaping of a shelter perhaps, or the working of a dugout canoe, or the excavation of a pit for storage or for burial. It is the tool of a settled skill, not the tool of a fleeting visit. And it lay for thousands of years on the ground of a country that had drowned around it, until a trawler came at last and hauled it back into the light. These are the first Doggerlanders, insofar as we can meet them at all. A jaw, a harpoon, a mattock, fragments, and only fragments, but fragments carrying the unmistakable signature of a human presence, of people who lived on the plain, who worked the rivers, who followed the herds, and who did not think of themselves as living on a bridge. They thought of themselves, one has to assume, as living where they lived. The country had a name, whatever that name may have been. The rivers had names. The good grounds and the dangerous grounds had names. The seasons brought their familiar changes, and the people met those changes with the accumulated wisdom of many generations. This was, by every measure that matters, a homeland. And it would remain a homeland for a long time yet, even as the water, patient, indifferent, and coming, began its slow work along the far edges of the plain. For a long time, the shape of that homeland was hidden even from those who had come to believe in its existence. The mandible and the harpoon and the mattock could tell you that people had been there, but they could not tell you where the good rivers had run, or where the lakes had gathered, or where the estuaries had opened out into brackish reed beds that would have thronged with waterfowl in autumn. They could not tell you the topography of the country. They could not tell you what it looked like from a canoe. To know a country, one needs its map, and Doggerland had no map, and could have no map, because the country itself lay beneath tens of metres of grey moving water, and the ground on which its rivers had cut their beds was buried in turn beneath the slow accumulated sediment of 8,000 marine years. What lay above was the North Sea, and the North Sea, seen from the deck of a trawler or the bridge of a survey vessel, gives up no obvious secrets. Its surface is uniform. Its charts show only bathymetric contours, the smoothed shapes of shoals and channels, without the fine grain of a lived world. For most of the 20th century, this was the impasse in which Doggerland existed. Its existence could be argued. Its people could be inferred from the objects the trawlers brought up, but its country, the plain itself, in the particular arrangement of its valleys and ridges, remained beyond reach. What changed this, in the middle years of the following century, was a piece of luck that historians of the discipline still marvel at. The oil and gas industry, in the course of its long prospecting work across the North Sea basin, had generated an enormous volume of seismic reflection data. These surveys, carried out by ships towing arrays of air guns and hydrophones, firing pulses of sound down into the seabed and recording the echoes that returned from each successive layer beneath, were designed to reveal the deep geology of the region, the folded and faulted rocks in which hydrocarbons might be trapped. They were not designed to reveal anything at all about the Mesolithic. The frequencies used, the depths of interest, the whole intellectual orientation of the work was tuned to the search for oil, but the sound pulses in their downward passage necessarily passed through the shallow post-glacial sediments as well, and in doing so they recorded, as an incidental byproduct, of no interest to the geologist passing the data for reservoirs, the buried topography of the drowned plain. The shape of a river valley cut into the surface of the last glaciation, and then buried under later marine muds, will register faintly on a seismic profile, if one knows how to look. The shape of a lake basin will register. The subtle differences in reflectivity between peat and clay and sand will register. The information was there, in the archives of the industry, in the tapes and the discs and the tape libraries of the survey companies. It only wanted an archaeologist with the imagination to ask for it, and the technical fluency to read it as a landscape rather than as a search for oil. That archaeologist in the middle years of the 2000s was Vincent Gaffney, of the University of Birmingham, working with the geophysicists Simon Fitch and the late Ken Thompson, and it is difficult in retrospect to overstate the strangeness of what they set out to do. They set out to reconstruct the surface of a country that no living human being had ever seen, using data gathered for an entirely different purpose by an industry with no interest in the question. They set out to make a map where no map could be made by direct observation. The project was called the North Sea Paleo Landscapes Project, and between roughly 2003 and 2007, it processed something on the order of 23,000 square kilometres of seismic data, patiently extracting the buried surface from the layers above and below it, and rendering, in 3 dimensions, the ground on which the first Doggerlanders had walked. 23,000 square kilometres, a piece of drowned country larger than the Netherlands, larger than several small European nations, comparable in extent to the whole of the modern Netherlands or a considerable share of the United Kingdom itself. And what emerged, when the maps were finished, was not the vague, generalised plain of earlier imagination, a featureless bridge across which people had walked from one shore to another, but a country of rivers, a country of lakes, a country of estuaries opening softly into a sea that lay much further to the north than we now find it, and hills rising in the west toward what would eventually become the eastern flank of Britain. There was, at the heart of it, a great river, which Gaffney and his colleagues named the Schotten, after the geologist Fred Schotten, whose earlier work had helped to establish the discipline of quaternary science in Britain. The Schotten ran across the northern portion of the mapped area, gathering to itself tributaries from the surrounding uplands, cutting a broad valley through the plain, and finding its way, at length, to the receding coastline of the retreating ice. It was not a small stream, it was a river of continental scale, in the sense that it drained a continental territory, and one can only imagine, for we have no photograph, no painting, no direct description, the width of its waters in flood, the slow curl of its meanders through the alluvium, the reeds standing along its margins, the wildfowl rising from its shallows at the approach of a canoe. Around and beside the Schotten the maps showed other rivers, smaller but still substantial, and between the rivers the flat interfluvial ground of a low plain, and in the hollows of that plain lake basins, some large, some small, and around the lake basins the characteristic soft geometry of wetlands, of marshes and reed beds and seasonal ponds. There were ridges rising as low hills. There were what appeared to be the fossilised traces of campsites, small anomalies at particular locations that suggested, though the resolution of seismic data allows only suggestion, not certainty, that Mesolithic people had built and rebuilt their fires and their shelters at those exact points, generation after generation. Doggerland, seen at last from above, was not a bridge. It was a country whose shape one could trace with a finger on a printed sheet, from the estuary in the west to the ridge in the east, from the lake district in the south to the river mouth in the north. The irony of the achievement was not lost on the man at the centre of it. The seismic data that had made this reconstruction possible had been gathered in the service of the fossil fuel industry, of the very industry whose combustion of ancient carbon is now driving the warming of the modern climate and the rise of the modern sea. The prehistoric world of Doggerland, drowned by the natural post-glacial rise of the ocean, was being revealed to us by the same instruments that were, in a longer arc, preparing the drowning of our own coastlines. Gaffney has spoken of this irony in interviews and in writing. He has also spoken of the strangeness of studying a country that no one can visit, a country whose surface lies further below us, in effective terms, than the surface of the moon lies above us. We know, he has remarked, more about the surface of the moon than we know about the ground on which the first Doggerlanders lit their fires. The moon is at least visible, the moon is at least photographed, the moon is at least reachable, in principle, by machines that can land upon it and send back images. The floor of the North Sea is none of these things. It is dark, it is cold, it is buried beneath water and beneath silt. And yet, through the patient reprocessing of data that no one had ever thought to read as a landscape, its shape has begun at last to emerge, and we can, for the first time, place the harpoon and the mattock and the mandible upon a country, and say, here, perhaps, is where they belonged. To place them there is to begin, however tentatively, to imagine the life that was lived upon that country, and this is where the archaeologist's map becomes something more than a map, becomes in effect an invitation to a species of disciplined imagination. We cannot photograph the first Doggerlanders. We cannot record their voices. We cannot ask them about the pattern of their year, or the arrangement of their kinship, or the stories they told at their fires. But we can, by combining the map with the artifact record, and with the record of similar Mesolithic peoples known from better preserved sites elsewhere in Europe, arrive at a reconstruction that is neither pure invention nor mere caution, but something in between. A picture rendered in general terms, coloured by the specifics that survive, and offered in the spirit of best available guess. Picture then a family group, or a small band of related families, for the Mesolithic seems to have been organised on that kind of scale, living at the junction of forest and marsh and open water. The forest, in the temperate centuries after the Holocene had warmed the plain, would have been dominated by oak and elm and hazel and lime, with alder in the wetter ground and pine on the higher and poorer soils. The marshes would have been vast, extending in some places for many kilometres from the courses of the rivers, and filled with the sounds of frogs and reed warblers and the drumming of snipe. The open water, the lakes, the estuarine channels, the slow, shallow inlets would have thronged in season with fish and with wildfowl. This was not marginal country. This was, on the contrary, some of the most productive country in post-glacial Europe. Wetlands are, ecologically, among the richest environments on the planet, generating more edible biomass per unit area than almost any other habitat, and Doggerland, in its wet, warm, early Holocene phase, was a country of wetlands upon wetlands. The people of that country would have moved with the seasons, but they would not have wandered aimlessly. Ethnographic study of hunter-gatherer societies known from more recent times suggests, again and again, that mobility is not vagabondage. It is a considered pattern, learned across generations, tuned to the productive rhythms of particular places. There would have been a summer camp, perhaps, on a stretch of estuarine shore where eels moved in their runs, and where fish weirs of woven withes could be set across the tidal creeks to trap them as the water fell. There would have been an autumn camp, perhaps, in a stand of hazel wood where the nuts ripened thick upon the branches and could be gathered in vast quantities, roasted for storage, and carried back through the winter as a dense, reliable staple of the diet. Some archaeologists have argued that the importance of the hazelnut in the Mesolithic diet has been overstated, since nuts preserve well in the archaeological record while roots and tubers preserve poorly, and it may be that the underground harvest of the marshes, the sweet rhizomes of reeds, the starchy tubers of water plants, was quietly as important as the nuts we can count. Whatever the precise balance, it is safe to say that the food supply of a Doggerland family would have been diverse in a way that few modern diets can match. Waterfowl in their vast migrating flocks, fish, both freshwater and estuarine, eels running in their millions along the wet corridors of the plain, red deer and roe deer and wild boar in the forest, taken with bow and with spear, and, very likely, driven toward the hunters by the deliberate use of fire, which will clear a reed bed or open a woodland glade, and create in the following season a lush new growth that game will find irresistible. Aurochs, larger and more dangerous, taken only when the circumstances allowed. Shellfish where the salt intruded. Berries and greens in their brief seasons. The occasional windfall of a stranded seal or a beached cetacean, which would have fed a whole camp for many days. And around this seasonal harvest a whole technology of quiet sophistication, the mattock we have already met, the harpoon we have already met. But there would have been much else that we do not have, because the ordinary materials of a Mesolithic life, wood, bark, hide, cordage of nettle and lime bast, netting of plant fibre, basketry of split willow, do not survive under most conditions in the ground, and least of all under the corrosive marine conditions of the North Sea floor. What we can guess at only through the occasional astonishing survival on some other site, elsewhere in Europe, where waterlogging or peat has preserved what would otherwise have vanished. A worked wooden paddle, for instance, has been recovered from the submerged forest beds of the Somerset levels in what is now southwestern England, dated to somewhere around 7,500 years before the current era. It is a paddle. It is a shaped piece of wood, cut from a single plank with a handle and a blade, made to be gripped and pulled through water. It is exactly the sort of thing that a Doggerlander would have used, on the Shotton or on one of its tributaries, to push a dugout canoe through the reeds, or to steady the craft in a running current, or to work quietly across a lake at first light. The paddle from the Somerset levels is not from Doggerland, and we should be careful to say so. But it is from the same broad cultural world, made by the same broad kind of people, using the same broad kind of technology, and it stands, in the absence of direct Doggerland evidence, as a legitimate proxy, an indication of what a Doggerland paddle would have been. There would have been canoes then. There must have been canoes. A country of rivers and lakes and estuaries is unthinkable without them. There would have been the paddles to drive the canoes, and the fish weirs to catch the eels, and the harpoons to spear the larger fish and the seals, and the mattocks to work the wood and dig the pits, and the bows and arrows to bring down the deer, and the nets, quite possibly, to lift the shoals of smaller fish out of the shallow lagoons. There would have been shelters, not permanent buildings most likely, but light-framed structures of poles and hides and thatch, put up quickly at the seasonal camps and pulled down or abandoned when the band moved on. There would have been hearths, whose blackened stones and charred wood have been found at Mesolithic sites all across Europe, and whose smoke drifting through the reeds at dusk would have marked the position of a camp for anyone approaching by water. There would have been children and old people, and the recently dead and the recently born. There would have been songs and stories and arguments and reconciliations. There would have been marriages arranged across the distances of the plain, and long walks or paddles to distant camps to attend the ceremonies of another band. There would have been trade, flints from good outcrops, amber from the eastern beaches, particular kinds of stone from particular quarries, moving hand to hand along the network of relationships. There would have been, in short, a life, in every particular that we know a life to contain, lived by people whose intelligence and skill and emotional depth were, we have every reason to believe, indistinguishable from our own. It is important, standing at the edge of the map that Gaffney and his colleagues have given us, to feel this. To feel that these were not distant abstractions, but people. To feel that the plain beneath the North Sea was not empty of anything except the abstract fact of habitation, but was crowded with the whole particular texture of human existence. The smoke, the voices, the paths worn between one camp and the next, the drying racks of fish along the shore, the sound of a paddle dipping and lifting in the pre-dawn quiet. This is what was there. This is what the map, held in the imagination alongside the artifacts, allows us to begin to reconstruct. And it is what would, in the fullness of what was coming, be taken away. For the sea was coming. It had been coming for a long time already, in a slow arc that had begun far away from the plain, and long before the plain became habitable. To understand the drowning of Doggerland, one has to understand that it was not a sudden thing in its origins, however sudden its final moments would prove to be. It was the tail end of an enormous planetary process that had been underway for something on the order of 6,000 or 7,000 years by the time the Mesolithic bands were paddling their canoes on the Schotten. It was the Great Thaw. At the height of the last glaciation, some 21,000 years ago, the northern latitudes of the planet had been locked under ice sheets of a scale that is difficult, from within the mild interglacial climate of the present, to conceive. The Laurentide ice sheet lay across most of what is now Canada and the northern United States, in places 3 kilometres thick. The Fennoscandian ice sheet lay across most of Scandinavia and reached south into what is now northern Germany and Poland, and west into the northern part of the British Isles. Smaller ice sheets and extensive mountain glaciers occupied the higher ground of many other regions. So much water was locked up in these ice sheets that the global sea level stood something on the order of 120 metres below its present position, low enough that the continental shelves were exposed as dry land almost everywhere they exist, and low enough that Doggerland was not an island, not a peninsula, but simply a portion of the continuous land surface between what is now Britain and what is now the Netherlands and Germany and Denmark. And then, beginning around 15,000 years ago, and accelerating sharply as the climate warmed into the Holocene after about 11,700 years ago, the ice began to collapse. The word collapse is used here deliberately. The melting of the great ice sheets was not a smooth uniform warming, like snow disappearing evenly from a lawn. It was a lurching, catastrophic process punctuated by episodes of astonishing rapidity, in which enormous volumes of ice broke down, released their locked water, and poured that water into the oceans in geologically brief intervals. Glaciologists have identified 2 of these episodes as being of particular importance, and they have given them names that sound almost bureaucratic beside the scale of what they describe. Meltwater Pulse 1A, which occurred somewhere between 14,600 and 13,500 years ago, may have raised global sea level by something on the order of 16 to 24 metres in less than 500 years, an average that, at its peak, could have amounted to several metres of rise per century, and, at the extreme of the peak, more still. Meltwater pulse 1b, occurring somewhere between 11,500 and 11,000 years ago, has been more contested. Some researchers regard it as a distinct pulse of comparable severity, while others regard it as merely an acceleration within the ongoing rise, without the sharp, catastrophic signature of its predecessor. The debate on the second pulse continues. The reality of the first is not in doubt. What this meant for the people of Doggerland and for the country they lived on was that the sea was always advancing, not always at the same rate, not always with the same visible urgency, but always advancing. Every generation, the coastline stood further inland than it had stood in the childhood memories of the oldest members of the band. The productive shellfish beds that the grandmothers had known as girls were now underwater, and one had to walk, or paddle, further to reach the new beds that had established themselves along the new shore. Familiar landmarks, a particular hill, a particular grove, a particular bend in a river, began to lie out in the shallow water, at first as islands, then as reefs, then as nothing but a memory shared among the elders and eventually forgotten. Hundreds of square kilometres of coastline vanished within a generation. In the peak intervals, even more. Vincent Gaffney has described the human experience of this process as an intricate minuet, a slow ceremonial dance between the people and the ocean lapping at their doorsteps, in which the humans were forced again and again to adjust their steps and their positions to the changing figure of the water. It was not, he has emphasised, a single deluge. It was a long, complex process of environmental change that unfolded over generations, a process in which each individual life saw only its own portion of the loss, and only the accumulated tradition of many lives could hold the memory of what had once been where. But the process, whatever the pace of any given century, was in one direction only. The sea did not retreat. The ice, once gone, did not return. What had been lost was lost, and what was still to be lost was, in the longer arc, already promised. The plain that lay so vividly upon the maps that Gaffney and his colleagues had at last produced, the plain of the Shotten and its tributaries, of the lakes and the reed beds and the estuarine wetlands, of the hazel woods and the eel runs and the deer paths, was from a certain distance in time already drowning. It had been drowning from the moment the ice began to collapse. It would continue to drown, slowly along most of its edges and more suddenly at moments still to come, until the last remnants of it were gone. And the people who lived upon it, who did not know what we now know about the mechanics of ice sheets, and the pulses of meltwater, and the long arc of a warming climate, would have known only that the sea, in their time, was a thief, a patient thief, an indifferent thief. But a thief that came, always, from the same direction, and always took the same thing, and never gave any of it back. To watch it happen, as we can now watch it happen in the maps and the models, is to see a country dissolve at the edges the way a lump of salt dissolves in slow-moving water. The southernmost margins go first. There, along the low southern plains where the paleo rivers of the Rhine and the Thames and the Meuse had woven their braided courses toward the Atlantic, the ground lies barely above the level of the encroaching sea, and the sea has only to rise a hand's breadth in a year, a metre in a generation, before the reed beds and the willow flats and the seasonal marshes are no longer seasonal at all. They are simply water. The tides begin to reach where the tides had never reached. Freshwater lagoons turn brackish. Brackish lagoons turn saline. Fish that once ran up the estuaries begin to fail, and other fish, seagoing and unfamiliar, arrive in their place. The eel runs shift. The reed-cutting places shift. The camps that had been set within a morning's walk of the shellfish beds must be lifted, pole by pole, and re-established further inland, on ground that had, only a few winters before, been considered too far from the water to be worth the effort. And then, a generation later, the new camps too must be moved. If one imagines the Great Plain as a slowly tilting board, one end of which is being submerged into a shallow bath, then the picture, in outline, is roughly correct. The southern rim goes under first, and the water then works its way northward and inward, following the low ground, filling the old river channels, spilling out across the intervening flats, isolating higher land as islands before eventually taking those islands too. What is now the English Channel, the narrow band of water that has for so long felt to those who live beside it, like a permanent fact of the map, was, through the earliest millennia of the Holocene, still a broad low corridor of land and marsh and slow river, through which one could walk, dry-shod for most of the way, from what is now Kent into what is now the Pas de Calais. Deer moved through it. Aurochs moved through it. People moved through it, tracing the shorelines of long inland lakes, camping on the gravel banks of the rivers, following the game trails between the ridges, and then, by roughly 6,500 years before the Common Era, the sea, working simultaneously from the Atlantic in the west and from the widening North Sea in the north, broke through. The precise mechanics remain a matter of research. Whether the breach came as a slow rising overtopping of a low watershed, or as a more sudden failure of a natural barrier, or as some combination of the two, is not entirely resolved. What is clear is that when the breach came, Britain, for the first time in the entire span of its human occupation, was an island. There is no memory in any human tradition that has come down to us in words of that event. There cannot be. The people who witnessed the last crossings on foot, or the last shallow wadings, or the moment when the last strip of dry land between the chalk cliffs on either side was finally swallowed, left no writing. They did not know that they were, in that generation, watching a geographical fact enter the world that would shape all of the history that followed. They only knew, perhaps, that a route their grandparents had used to visit relatives on the other side had, in their own lifetime, become impassable. That the crossing now required a boat where once it had required only patience and dry feet. That the world was, in yet one more particular, smaller than it had been. Northward of the new strait, the process continued at its own pace. The central lowlands of Doggerland, the great heart of the country, where the Shotten had run, and where the wetlands had held their tapestry of reed and open water and low willow scrub, did not vanish all at once, but transformed, over centuries, into a vast brackish lagoon. The rivers still ran for a time into this lagoon. The wood still stood on the higher ground around its margins, but the ground beneath the shallow water was slowly poisoning from the perspective of the plants that had grown upon it with the salt of the sea. Oak and elm on the low ground began to die, standing where they stood, their roots pickling in the rising brine, their crowns going bare and then falling one by one across seasons that no living person alive today ever saw. Salt marsh took over the ground the woods had held. Then the salt marsh too went under and became mudflat, and then became shallow sea. The lagoon widened, its margins retreated, the islands within it grew smaller, and through all of this, the Doggerbank, the great high ground that had once been the interior heart of the country and would give its name, thousands of years later, to Dutch fishing boats and to the fishing grounds themselves, remained. It remained as a highland at first, a great swelling of ground above the surrounding wetlands. Then, as the surrounding wetlands became lagoon and the lagoon became sea, it remained as a hill above the water. Then, as a peninsula, connected by a narrow neck to what was left of the mainland further east. Then, as the neck too went under, as a single, large island. Then, as an archipelago of smaller islands, separated by widening channels of shallow water. And then, at last, likely somewhere between 7,000 and 5,000 years before the Common Era, the exact final date is still argued over, as nothing at all above the surface. A shoal, a shallow, a place where the water in certain lights and certain seas still remembers that there was once ground beneath it, but where there is now only sand and gravel and the moving weight of the tide. One thinks, standing back from the map, of what this meant in the language of families and camps and hunting grounds. A territory that had once, in the tens of thousands of square kilometres, sustained perhaps thousands of people in loose networks of related bands, moving with the seasons between the coast and the interior, between the eel rivers and the deer woods and the shellfish reefs, was, over the course of some 4,000 years, compressed to nothing. The bands that had lived on the southernmost plains had to move north. The bands that had lived in the central wetlands had to move to the margins, and then to the islands, and then off the islands. The routes between one band's territory and the next, routes that had been walked for generations and marked in memory by every stream crossing and every stand of hazel, became impassable, or shortened, or lost. Marriage networks that had spanned the plain narrowed, trade in flint and antler and amber, in the good stone from one region and the good bone from another, had to reorganize itself around new coastlines. Whole ancestral grounds, the places where the elders were buried, where certain hunting rites had been performed for generations, where the tradition said the first people had come out of the earth, went under, and were no longer places at all but memories, and then not even memories. And yet the people did not vanish. They moved. They adjusted. That is the quiet dignity, if one may use the word, of the whole long story. That a folk who could not have understood, in any modern sense, what was happening to their homeland, nevertheless kept living within it, kept adjusting to it, kept making a place for themselves at the shrinking edges of the ground. The barbed harpoon dredged up by the trawler Kalinda in 1931, that first, quiet, world-changing barbed antler point, hauled from the North Sea floor into the light of a Norfolk afternoon, and later understood as a Mesolithic tool made by a person who had walked upon a land that was no longer there, is one small material trace of that continuing life. It was not made by a ghost. It was made by someone who woke in the morning, took up their work, and went to the river or to the shore to hunt or to fish, and lost or discarded or perhaps deliberately deposited this small worked implement upon ground that they had every reason to regard as permanent. The ground has since ceased to be ground. The harpoon has not ceased to be a harpoon. It sits now in the collections of a museum and speaks, in its careful barbs and its patient antler curvature, of a competence and a domesticity and a settled relation to place that the sea, however patient it was, could not entirely dissolve. What remains of that country, and what may yet be retrieved from it, is the concern of a new generation of researchers who have taken up the work of reading the drowned world not only from seismic ghosts on a computer screen, but from the physical sediment of the seabed itself. The Europe's Lost Frontiers project, funded from 2015 onward by a substantial European Research Council advance grant of some €2.5 million, and led again by Vincent Gaffney out of the University of Bradford, has extended the earlier mapping work over an area on the order of 85,000 square kilometres of the North Sea floor, a territory larger than many modern nations, and has moved from mapping alone into direct physical prospection. Vessels have been sent out over the areas of highest archaeological potential, identified in the seismic record, the buried river channels, the confluences where camps were most likely to have been sited, the old lake margins and the meanders where fish weirs might have stood. From these vessels, long tubes have been driven into the seabed to recover sediment cores, cylinders of mud and clay, and deeper down the preserved old land surface itself, sealed and protected beneath the marine deposits that had settled on top of it after the drowning. The cores, when they come up onto the deck and are cleaned and split lengthwise, reveal a stratigraphy that is legible in the same way that any archaeological section is legible. Layers of different colour and texture, layers of organic content, layers where the character of the sediment changes and speaks of a different environmental moment. Beneath the marine clays lies, in many places, the dark band of the old Mesolithic land surface, the peat, the soil, the traces of the ground upon which the people walked, and within that band, or upon it, the researchers have been able to extract not only the visible archaeology and paleoecology, the pollen, the seeds, the fragments of wood, the occasional worked flake, but also, in one of the more remarkable methodological developments of recent decades, sedimentary ancient DNA. The soil, that is to say, remembers, at the level of its molecules, the plants and animals that lived upon it. Fragments of the genetic material of oak, of hazel, of birch, of the mammals and the birds and the insects and even the human presence, can under favourable conditions be recovered from a pinch of dark mud that has lain beneath 60 metres of seawater for 8,000 years. From this work, the picture of Doggerland's later millennia, the picture of the country as it was during its long dying, has become progressively fuller. It was, the DNA and the pollen agree, a wooded landscape well into the Mesolithic. It was not, in its final centuries, a barren strand or a bleak marsh, but a living country of trees and undergrowth and open glades, with the animals and the plant communities appropriate to such a country. And it remained so in significant portions, even after the great tsunami whose signature we are now approaching in this story. After that shock, which one might have expected to end the country in a single afternoon, some parts of the wood still stood, and some parts of the ground remained above the water for centuries more. This is one of the counterintuitive lessons of the recent research, that the drowning was neither instantaneous nor uniform, and that resilience in the country as in the people was longer lived than the older, more catastrophic reconstructions had allowed. A landmark of that direct prospection came with the recovery, from the seabed of a flint hammerstone, the first artifact retrieved not by chance in a fishing net, but by intentional archaeological targeting, guided by the seismic maps to the precise part of the drowned landscape where such an object might be expected to lie. That the target was hit and the object recovered was a demonstration in principle that the drowned country is not simply lost to us, that its archaeology can be found on purpose where the maps predict it, that the ordinary tools of a Mesolithic camp, the hammerstones, the flint flakes, the antler points, the wooden implements when preservation allows, can be lifted from a seabed 60 metres below the modern surface, brought up into the daylight, and read as one reads the finds from any dry land excavation. It is slow work and expensive, and constrained by weather and by depth, and by the practical difficulties of doing archaeology from a ship. But it is possible. Gaffney has been direct about the significance. The only populated lands upon the earth, he has said, that have not yet been explored in any depth are those that have been lost beneath the sea. That is the field. That is what is still waiting. Within that field, among the many features that the seismic surveys have flagged for particular attention are hearths. A hearth, on the seismic record, reads as a small, discrete feature with a particular acoustic signature, a place where the ground has been burned, hardened, altered by the repeated warmth of fires. A hearth is a domestic thing. It is where a family gathered. It is where the food was cooked, and the tools were repaired, and the children were told the stories of where the family had come from. When the researchers of Europe's lost frontiers identify a candidate hearth on the seabed, in one of the buried valleys or beside one of the buried streams, they are identifying in principle a specific evening, a specific set of people, a specific fire. 60 metres below the modern surface of the North Sea, in ground that has not seen the sky since the sea took it, there lie the ashes and the burnt stones of a night when someone tended a flame. What we may yet recover in the coming decades from such a site, the charcoal, the animal bones, the fragments of tool-making debris, will tell us something of that evening. The evening itself is beyond us. The residue of it is not. To sit with this thought, in the quiet of a modern room, is to feel the strange geometry of what the archaeology is doing. It is bringing back, one small material trace at a time, evidence of the ordinary life that filled a country as large as many European nations over thousands of years, and that has been almost wholly erased from any place where erasure could be resisted. There are no walls left standing. There are no monuments upon the skyline. There are, so far as we can tell, no burials in any of the ways that the later Neolithic would eventually make familiar upon the surrounding dry lands. The record is small and intimate and difficult to reach, and it is nearly all that we have. That it exists at all, and that the technology and the patience now exist to go looking for it, is one of the quieter miracles of the current moment in the study of the human past. But the country was not permitted to fade only by the slow arithmetic of the meltwater. Something else was coming out of the deep water to the north, which the sediment record has for decades allowed geologists to see clearly, and which the human record, if it survives at all, survives only in the manner in which the ground itself was rearranged by the passage of the wave. Off the western edge of the Norwegian continental shelf, at a place whose modern name is the Storegga, the Great Edge, the continental margin, at some moment approximately 8,150 years ago gave way. What gave way was not a small slip. It was one of the largest submarine landslides of which the geological record of the Holocene bears witness anywhere upon the Earth. Something on the order of 3,500 cubic kilometres of sediment, along a stretch of the shelf edge some 290 kilometres in extent, detached itself from the margin and slid downslope into the deep basin of the Norwegian Sea. The number is difficult to hold in the mind. 3,500 cubic kilometres. It is a volume of loose material that would, if piled onto a modern country, bury that country to a depth of many metres. It is more sediment than all the world's rivers together carry to the sea in a great many years. It came off the shelf in a single geological instant, in blocks and slurries and turbid flows, and it displaced as it moved an equivalent volume of seawater. That displacement is what mattered, from the point of view of the coasts. The trigger for the collapse is not entirely settled. Two mechanisms are most often proposed, and it is possible, indeed likely, that both played some role. One is seismic, an earthquake in the region of the shelf edge, sufficient to destabilize sediments that were already, after the long post-glacial adjustment of the crust, in a state of latent instability. The other is the dissociation, under changing conditions of temperature and pressure, of the methane clathrates that lay locked within the sediment column, solid ices of methane and water, stable under cold high-pressure conditions that can, if warmed or depressurized past a critical threshold, revert to gas and liquid in a way that catastrophically weakens the material in which they were held. Whether one or the other, or the two together, set the great mass of the shelf edge moving, the outcome was the same. The shelf gave way. The water above it was thrown into a form that could not, on the scale of a whole ocean basin, be locally absorbed. A tsunami was generated, and that tsunami travelled outward. The reading of that wave has been a long, patient, almost forensic work of geological detective story, taken up over decades by researchers including David Smith of Coventry University and the Scottish geologist Alistair Dawson, among a considerable community of collaborators across the North Atlantic. What they have looked for, in outcrops along the coasts of eastern Scotland, in peat sequences in the low ground behind Norwegian fjords, in exposures on the Faroe Islands and in Iceland, and in more recent work even in eastern Greenland, is a very particular kind of sedimentary signature. A thin, distinctive layer of sand, often with marine microfossils in it, often with a graded structure that speaks of rapid deposition under moving water, intruded improbably high into terrestrial or freshwater sequences that had, before and after, nothing to do with the sea. Such layers are what the specialists call tsunamites, sediments laid down by the passage of a great wave onto ground that had otherwise been dry. And around the North Atlantic, at a stratigraphic level that dates consistently to some 8,150 years before the present, such a layer appears again and again in places where the wave would have been able to reach. From those deposits and from the run-up heights that they imply, that is, from the elevation above the contemporary sea level at which the marine sand appears in the section, the models have reconstructed the character of the wave as it struck each coast. Along the western coast of Norway, close to the source, run-up heights of the order of 10 to 20 metres appear to have been common, with some localities registering considerably more, depending on the shape of the fjord and the orientation of the shoreline. Along the eastern coasts of Scotland, run-ups of some 3 to 6 metres have been documented in a number of places, with local values pushed higher by funneling in narrow inlets. In the Shetland Isles, where the geometry of the archipelago concentrates and amplifies incoming waves, model results and field evidence together suggest run-ups that may in places have exceeded 20 metres, and some studies have argued for still greater local values, and upon whatever remained of Doggerland, upon the shrinking islands of the Dogger archipelago, upon the low shores of the vast central lagoon, upon the coasts of the eastern mainland that the sea had not yet reached, a wave came from the north of a size that the people who lived there had never in their tradition seen and had no reason to expect. We are approaching, in this story, the moment of that wave, the moment when the slow, patient dance of the coastline and the ocean, the intricate minuet that Gaffney has described, was interrupted for a single afternoon and a single evening and a single tide by something entirely different, something that was not patient, something that did not come metre by metre and generation by generation, but arrived in a single passage and passed and left behind a shore rearranged. Even before we come to the moment itself, one may sit for a while with the geology and with the sheer scale of the collapse that produced it, and with the long, careful work of Smith and Dawson and their colleagues in reading the sand layers that mark its passage. One may consider that the same event that today registers as a bright, unmistakable line in a peat section behind a Scottish beach, or as a graded sand in a Norwegian fjord bog, or as an anomalous stratum on a Faroes cliff, registered in the 8,150th year before this present as an afternoon in which the sea did something it had not, within any human memory then living, ever done. The geologists Knut Rydgren and Stein Bondevik, considering the human implications of this event upon the Mesolithic populations of the region, have written of it with a care and a restraint appropriate to what can and cannot be inferred. The loss of stores, of infrastructure, of tools, they have observed, must have caused serious problems. Many survivors, they have suggested, may have succumbed during the first winter. That is a plain, undramatic sentence, and it holds, within its plainness, a great deal of what will need to be said in the following passages of this story about what it might have been to live upon that coast, or upon those islands, in the years immediately after the wave went through, but the wave itself has not yet in this telling arrived. The shelf has given way. The water has been thrown into its terrible new shape. The energy of the collapse is travelling outward, at the speed at which such energy travels in deep ocean water toward every shore that the geometry of the basin will allow it to reach. And upon those shores, in the last of the ordinary hours before the wave is seen, the people of the drowning country are going about their afternoon, as they have gone about every other afternoon, on the ground that is still, for a little while longer, ground. The wave arrived in the way that all such waves arrive, not as a wall visible from the horizon, but as a withdrawal, first, of water from the shore, the sea pulling back, uncovering ground that had not known open air in some time, exposing the tidal flats and the sand and the lower reaches of the estuary margins in a strange, unnatural recession, as though the ocean were considering its next motion, gathering itself into something that had not yet been named. In deep water, the energy of the Storegga collapse had been travelling at a speed comparable to that of a jet aircraft, somewhere in the range of 800 kilometers per hour. Not a ripple, not a swell, but a compression of the entire water column, a compression that only becomes a wave in the shallow coastal margins where the column cannot hold its shape, where the seafloor rises to meet it, and the energy has nowhere to go but upward. And as that energy reached those margins, and the seafloor rose beneath it, and the wave rose in response, what had been invisible and undetectable in the open ocean became, quite suddenly, everything. The people of the Dogger archipelago on those low-lying islands of silt and peat and sedge-grass that the post-glacial sea had been slowly compiling from the drowned interior of the country would have had very little warning of what was coming. Some accounts of how such events unfold suggest that the initial withdrawal might have drawn curiosity before it drew fear, the shore doing something it had not done before, the fish stranded on the exposed bed, the birds rising and crying over the suddenly revealed mud, the familiar geography of the waterline altered in a way that was puzzling before it became terrible, and then the water returned. What the wave carried was not merely water. The geological record is precise on this point, in the way that geology is precise about material things even when it cannot tell us what those material things meant to the people who were swept away by them. The sand layer that geologists now extract from peat cores across the coastlines of Scotland and the Shetland Islands. The layer that researchers describe as a synchronous marker horizon, meaning that it appears in the same stratigraphic position across dozens of separated sites, a simultaneous inscription in the archive of the land, is not ordinary beach sand, not the gentle accumulation of tide and season. It contains the broken frustules of marine diatoms, the microscopic silica shells of organisms such as Paralia sulcata, species that inhabit the open sea and the turbulent high-energy environment of breaking surf, and whose presence deep within a coastal peat, entombed between the slow-grown laminae of bog moss and sedge root, tells a clear and unambiguous story about the force with which those organisms were transported. The sand was moved, and the diatoms were moved, and with them moved everything else that the wave could carry. Boulders displaced from their beds, mature trees ripped from the peat banks where their roots had held for centuries, the sediment of beaches and estuary mouths thrown inland and deposited in a new and disordered stratigraphy. The land, in the hours that the wave was active, was not merely flooded. It was rearranged, reinscribed, its long-settled order overwritten in a single passage of water and debris and concentrated energy. The Shetland Islands, lying in the direct path of the wave and shaped in such a way that their geometry amplified and concentrated the incoming force, received what the field evidence and the modelling studies together suggest were run-ups of 25 to 30 metres above sea level in certain localities, values so extreme that the word wave seems structurally inadequate to describe what came ashore. On the coasts of mainland Scotland, where the geometry was less severe and the continental shelf provided more distance across which the energy could disperse, run-ups of 3 to 6 metres have been documented, with local values higher in confined inlets and lower on open, gently shelving shores. Norway received the wave from its other face, and the bogs and lake sediments of that coast also carry the sand layer, and the studies of Knut Rydgren and Stein Bondevik, among others, have traced its position with great care in the stratigraphy of numerous sites, reading from the depth of the deposit and the character of the material above and below it, the story of what happened at each of those places on that afternoon, and on the days and seasons and years that followed. Upon what remained of Doggerland, the wave fell upon a landscape already diminished by everything the preceding 4,000 years had taken from it. The great interior plain was gone, the valley of the Shotten River long since submerged, the forests of oak and hazel that had once shaded its banks reduced to drowned roots beneath the salt water of the Central Sea. What persisted, in the decades approaching 6,100 BCE, was an archipelago, the Dogger Bank rising as a low, waterlogged island or cluster of islands at the heart of what had once been the heartland of the country, and around it the surviving coastal margins of wetland and estuary that clung to the shrinking shoreline like the last threads of a fabric coming apart. These were the places where the people of the drowning country had concentrated across the long centuries of retreat, where the richest resources of the region remained, where the estuaries still offered fish, and the wetland margins still offered game, where the network of seasonal camps and semi-permanent settlements had drawn ever closer together as the habitable ground contracted. It was these places, the places where people lived in the greatest numbers, in the highest density that this diminished landscape could sustain, that the wave struck first and hardest, and with the least mercy. The force of what came ashore on those low-lying coasts can only be inferred, since the islands themselves now lie beneath the sea and have not yet yielded, in any core that has been retrieved, a direct sedimentary account of their own destruction. What the record does preserve, in the broader pattern of the evidence, is the absence of what should follow, the absence, in the subsequent Mesolithic record of the region, of a people who were there and then continued there. The islands, it seems, did not survive the wave as inhabited places, or if they did not persist as inhabited places for very long. The wave and the sea level rise that continued in its aftermath finished what the slow transgression had been undertaking for thousands of years. The land was gone. The ground that had been ground for all the generations of memory and all the accumulated knowledge of the people who had called it home became, in the passage of a single day and a single tide, the floor of a sea. We do not know how many people were living on Doggerland's remaining coasts and islands in the years before the wave came. The total Mesolithic population of Britain is estimated, by those who have attempted to reckon it from the available archaeological record, at somewhere in the range of 5,000 to perhaps 10,000 individuals, a number so small that it strains comprehension for those accustomed to thinking about human populations in millions and billions. These figures carry wide ranges and wide uncertainties, as all Mesolithic population estimates must, and they are best understood as rough orders of magnitude rather than precise counts. The population of what remained of Doggerland itself, in those final centuries before the wave, would have been a portion of that regional total, but the precise proportions are not recoverable. What can be said with more confidence is that the wetland margins and estuarine coasts were, in Mesolithic terms, the most productive and the most densely settled environments available in the region. The richness of the resource base, the fish running in the estuary channels, the wildfowl thick on the wetland pools, the game drawn to the water's edge, the shellfish of the intertidal zones, the plant foods of the fen margins and the riverbanks, would have drawn people to these places and sustained them there across the generations, in densities higher than the more open and less productive inland terrain could support. If Doggerland's coasts held a disproportionate share of the regional population, as the ecology of the landscape strongly suggests they would have, then the wave did not strike a sparse and scattered people moving lightly through an empty landscape. It struck a concentration. It struck in the terms available to Mesolithic northwestern Europe, something that might fairly be called a heartland. The researchers who have considered the human implications of the Storegga event have been careful, as the evidence obliges them to be, about what can and cannot be said. John Hill of the University of York has described the scale of such a wave as entirely different from anything that the people living there would have experienced. A truly terrifying thing, in his words, for communities whose entire relationship with the sea had been shaped by the patient rhythms of tide and season and the slow generational withdrawal of the shore. Nothing in the Mesolithic memory of the North Sea would have prepared those communities for what the wave was, in its nature and its sudden arrival. Nothing in the long tradition of reading the water and the weather and the behaviour of the coast would have given the people on those low shores a framework within which to understand what they were witnessing as the water first withdrew, unnaturally and completely, and then returned in a form that the sea had never, within any living memory, taken. The event lay, in its character and its scale, entirely outside the range of experience that the culture preserved and transmitted, and for a people whose knowledge of the world was embedded in that culture, in the accumulated wisdom of generations of careful observation and patient practice, in the stories and the seasonal lore and the inherited understanding of what the land and the water could and could not do. The wave would have arrived not merely as a physical catastrophe, but as a rupture in the fabric of the knowable world itself. The land had done something the land was not supposed to do. The sea had crossed a boundary that no elder, no keeper of knowledge, no living memory could account for. In the aftermath, the evidence of what happened to the communities of the wider region is fragmentary and difficult to read, as Mesolithic evidence always and everywhere is. The sites at Howick and Low Hawksley in Northumberland, settlements on the coast of northeastern England within the reach of the wave's disruption, have been examined as case studies in what the event may have done to coastal Mesolithic life in the years around it. Researchers working at these and comparable sites have noted evidence of settlement disruption, of material culture that shifts in ways that speak of communities navigating changed and uncertain circumstances, and have placed this disruption in the wider context of the wave and of the climatic disturbance that followed in its decades. The event now known as the 8.2 thousand year cooling, a rapid and severe drop in temperatures driven by the final collapse of the Laurentide ice sheet's remnants into the North Atlantic, injecting a pulse of cold fresh water that disrupted the ocean circulation, followed within a few centuries of the Storegga wave, and together these disruptions compounded one upon another in the lives of those who survived them. The physical destruction of the wave, the ecological upheaval of the cooling, the continued and remorseless loss of coastal ground to rising seas, each aggravated the others, each narrowed the margin between subsistence and failure that Mesolithic communities in this part of the world had been navigating for generations. The first winter after the wave, Rydgren and Bondevik have observed with their characteristic restraint, would have been particularly severe. The stores of food that Mesolithic communities' depended upon through the cold months, the stores that represented the labour of seasons past, the accumulated insurance against winter's harshest demands, had, in many cases, been washed away or contaminated or simply scattered in the chaos that the wave had left behind in its retreat. The patient work of drying and smoking and laying aside that sustained Mesolithic life through the dark months had been undone in hours, and the communities who had survived the physical passage of the wave found themselves entering the first winter of the post-Storegga world without the reserves that survival required. It is a detail that carries its own particular weight of human consequence. Not the drama of the wave itself, which is legible at least in the scale of its destruction, but the quieter and more relentless suffering of the months that followed, the slow arithmetic of hunger and cold and grief in communities already diminished, already reduced, already stretched to the edge of what was bearable, and against all of it, the wave, the cold, the continued and patient encroachment of the water on the last remaining ground. The communities who survived had, as the evidence most plainly implies, no choice but to endure and adapt, to gather what remained of their knowledge and their relationships and their sense of who they were, and to find a way forward through a world that had been irrevocably altered. Yet the story the North Sea tells, the story of Doggerland, of the Storegga wave, of the long and painful drowning of a landscape that once sustained tens of thousands of lives across generations, is, at its most essential, not a story about the North Sea at all. It is a story about the sea itself, and about the scale of what was lost in those millennia of rising water that reshaped the face of the world between the last great glaciation and the earliest traces of recorded history. The North Sea is simply the place where that story has been most carefully excavated, most thoroughly documented, most attentively heard, the place where the particular accidents of trawling and seismic surveying and the sustained labour of a generation of researchers have returned voices and names and landscapes to a drowned world. But the drowning itself was not local, and it was not regional. It was, in the most literal sense, universal, and the communities of the North Sea coast were not exceptional in their loss. They were one example, one chapter, in a story that unfolded on every inhabited coast on Earth across a span of more than 14,000 years. Between roughly 20,000 and 6,000 years ago, as the great ice sheets of the last glaciation, the Laurentide across the breadth of North America, the Fennoscandian across northern Europe, the countless smaller sheets and caps and valley glaciers that had locked water away from the world's oceans for tens of millennia surrendered their mass to rising temperatures and the cascading urgency of meltwater pulses. Global sea levels rose by something in the order of 100 to 120 metres. This is a figure that is easy to state and genuinely difficult to comprehend in the fullness of what it describes, because what it represents is not merely a change in elevation, not merely the tide line retreating a little further up the beach or the estuary mouth moving a little nearer to the interior, but the systematic, relentless, generation-by-generation erasure of the most productive and densely inhabited geography that the world then possessed. The continental shelves, those shallow marginal platforms that ring the land masses of the Earth, and that were, during the last glacial maximum, exposed to the open air and inhabited and traversed and loved by human beings, received those rising waters and did not give them back. The sea claimed, over those 14,000 years, an estimated 27 million square kilometres of continental shelf. To hold that number steady in the mind requires a comparison, and the comparison that scientists and archaeologists have drawn is precise. 27 million square kilometres is an area larger than the entire continent of Africa. The Africa of our atlases, of our sense of the world's great landmasses, the entirety of that vast and ancient continent, was lost, piece by piece, coast by retreating coast, to the waters of the retreating ice age. It is a loss that is very nearly impossible to mourn in the way that more intimate losses are mourned, because its scale exceeds the reach of human grief, and because the communities who endured it have left so few traces for those who would wish to attend to what they suffered. The continental shelves now submerged were at the height of the last glacial maximum, and in the long centuries of relative stability that preceded the Great Melt, the most productive coastal environments on Earth. Broad, low, river-threaded plains where the meeting of fresh and salt water created conditions for extraordinary biological richness, where the fish and the shellfish and the migratory birds and the large terrestrial game that sustained human communities gathered in quantities that the exposed interior uplands could rarely match. The people who lived on those shelves, the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and their predecessors, communities whose names and languages and stories are lost to us entirely, had built their lives around the specific and particular resources of specific and particular coasts, and when those coasts Doctor owned, so did they. Turn the eye westward, then, from the North Sea, and westward again, across the shrinking continent of Europe, and across the width of the Atlantic, and across the whole span of the Americas, and further still, until the map wraps around upon itself and delivers the attention to a place that once was not a strait but a country, between what is now the eastern extremity of Siberia and what is now the western extremity of Alaska. There lies today a stretch of grey and difficult water, the Bering Strait, narrow enough that on a clear day, from the right vantage, one shore is said to be visible from the other. It is a passage that ships pick their way through with care, and that the imagination has long treated as a kind of doorway, a slender hinge between two hemispheres. But the doorway metaphor, so familiar, so persistent, so nearly reflexive when the subject is raised, is a distortion of what once existed there. It reduces a subcontinent to a threshold, it compresses a homeland to a corridor, and it does an injustice, quiet but profound, to the human beings who lived there for what may have been 10,000 years before they were the first ancestors of the peoples of the Americas. At its maximum extent, when the ice was at its most voracious, and the oceans at their most withdrawn, the land that scientists now call Beringia stretched something on the order of 1,600 kilometres from north to south, from the frozen shores of the Arctic Ocean down toward the northern reaches of what is now the Pacific, and nearly 5,000 kilometres east to west, from the interior of Siberia across to the interior of Alaska and the Yukon. In area, it was roughly the size of Australia. It was not a bridge, it was a country, and by any measure of geography it was a substantial one, and it existed for long enough, through cold millennia in which the ice sheets held their vast reserves of water hostage above the sea, for entire ecologies and entire human generations to know it as home. The mainstream reconstruction, drawn from pollen cores and animal remains, and the careful sampling of sediments recovered from the exposed edges of what was once its interior, describes a landscape that was cold and dry, treeless in most of its expanse, and yet astonishingly productive, a steppe tundra ecosystem, a biome that has few close analogues in the world today, characterised by hardy grasses and sedges and low herbaceous plants, nourished by lower soils, and by a climate arid enough to prevent the formation of the ice sheets that smothered so much of the surrounding continents. Across this vast, cold, open plain moved the great herds that the mammoth steppe supported wherever it survived. Woolly mammoths, steppe bison, wild horses, caribou, and the predators that shadowed them. Short-faced bears, wolves, cats built for cold pursuit. It was a world that the human imagination, primed by picture book images of tundra as barren waste, tends to underestimate, and it was in fact one of the great larders of the late Pleistocene. Yet the herds were only part of what Beringia sheltered. The other part, and for our purposes the more consequential part, was human. The archaeological and genetic evidence, the latter of it accumulated with astonishing speed over the last 2 decades, drawn from the sequencing of ancient bones recovered in Siberia and Alaska and further south, has converged upon a picture in which a founding population of the Americas resided in Beringia not merely as passers-through but as inhabitants, for a span of time estimated at something in the order of 10,000 years. This is the Beringian standstill, as some geneticists have called it, a long interval during which a population that had separated genetically from its East Asian relatives, but which had not yet begun the expansion that would eventually people the Americas from Alaska to Patagonia, endured somewhere in that vast subcontinent, hunted its herds, sheltered from the winds of the glacial maximum in whatever protected valleys and river corridors the country afforded, and became, in the slow accumulation of generations and adaptations and inherited knowledge, distinctly themselves. The precise timing of their arrival in Beringia, and the precise timing of their expansion out of it, remain matters of active debate, with estimates for the human presence in the wider region ranging from roughly 30,000 years ago to as late as 15 or 14,000, and the debate is a real one, with new evidence continuing to reshape it. But the broad shape of the story is not seriously contested. People lived in Beringia. They lived there for a long time, and when the climate warmed and the corridors southward opened, some of their descendants moved into the 2 vast continents that lay waiting beyond the ice, and became, over the millennia that followed, the ancestors of every indigenous people of the Americas. And then the sea rose, and it took the country. The flooding of the Bering Land Bridge is dated, by most of the studies that have attended to it, to something in the order of 11,000 years ago, a moment when the meltwater from the receding ice sheets had raised global sea levels enough to breach the low central plain of Beringia and to re-establish the marine connection between the Arctic and the Pacific. The waters came into the interior slowly at first, along the lowest of the river valleys, and then more insistently, and then, in the final centuries, decisively. The country did not sink in a single catastrophic event of the Storegga kind. It drowned in the manner that Doggerland drowned, generation by generation, coast by retreating coast, camp by abandoned camp, until the 2 continents that had been for so long joined were 2 continents again, and the strait that now bears the name of Vitus Bering had opened between them. The founding populations of the Americas, whose descendants had by then moved south into ice-freed corridors and coastal routes, and were spreading through the continents, were severed from their Siberian relatives by the same waters that were, at that same moment, severing Britain from Europe and drowning the Sunda Shelf and pushing across the sill into the Black Sea basin. It was the same rise, it was the same story. It was, in the fullest and most literal sense possible, the same global event, playing out on every inhabited coast that the world then possessed. And what did that flooding take with it at the American end? It took, in almost all likelihood, the greater part of the archaeological record of the first Americans. This is a difficulty that has haunted the archaeology of the American peopling from its earliest serious formulation, and it is a difficulty that has grown more, not less, acute as the science has matured. If the founding population lived in Beringia for 10,000 years, and if a substantial portion of that country now lies beneath the Chukchi and Bering Seas, then the campsites, the hearths, the middens, the tool scatters, the burial places, the whole material substrate of that long standstill lie, for the most part, submerged. And if some of the earliest movements of people down into the Americas followed a coastal route, as a growing body of evidence suggests, with populations moving southward along the kelp-rich margins of the Pacific Rim, then those coastal camps too lie now beneath the sea, along a shoreline that has retreated inland by many kilometres in most places and by more than 100 metres in vertical elevation. The archaeologist John Hoffaker has observed of these sites that they are among the most searched for and least found in all of human prehistory, buried under thousands of years of frozen dirt or hidden beneath the waves. It is a formulation of striking precision because it names the two conditions, the permafrost and the sea, that between them have made the recovery of this record so profoundly difficult. And so, Beringia joins the growing catalogue. Doggerland in the North Atlantic, the Sunda Shelf in the tropics, the Black Sea Basin in the interior of Eurasia, the drowned plains of the Persian Gulf, the exposed coasts of Sahel, the continental shelf of the eastern seaboard of North America, where mastodon teeth are dredged, as they are in the North Sea, by fishermen who did not expect them. Every continent bears the watermark of the Holocene transgression. Every inhabited landmass has its lost margin. And the peculiar mercy, if it is a mercy, of the North Sea case, the reason we know so much about Doggerland relatively, and so much less about the drowned country that once linked Asia to America, is nothing more than the accident of intensive maritime traffic, dense hydrocarbon exploration, and a generation of researchers who chose to look. The rest of the drowned world waits for the equivalent attention, and much of it will wait a long time. That waiting, however, is not what it once was. The tools that the science can now bring to bear upon submerged prehistory represent, by any reasonable estimation, a revolution, and one that has unfolded largely in the last 2 decades, in near silence relative to the more visible sciences, in a slow accumulation of technical capacity that has only recently begun to yield the kinds of results that are visible from outside the specialist journals. Consider what is now possible on a submerged Mesolithic landscape. Multi-beam sonar, mounted on the hulls of survey vessels and swept in overlapping fans across the seabed, can now resolve topographic features at the scale of individual centimetres, not merely the broad ridges and valleys of the drowned country, but the small particular anomalies that betray a hearthstone, a collapsed timber, a linear feature that ought not to be there. Sub-bottom profiling using acoustic pulses tuned to penetrate the sediments themselves can locate the buried soil horizons of the last terrestrial surface, the ground that Mesolithic feet walked upon before the peats formed and the marine mud settled, soils that have not been disturbed since the sea covered them, and that preserve within them the intact stratigraphy of a lost land. Sediment cores, driven vertically into the seabed and retrieved in long unbroken columns, contain within their layers the pollen of vanished forests, the microscopic remains of insects and diatoms and freshwater ostracods, the charcoal fragments of ancient fires. Palynological analysis reads those layers season by season, decade by decade, and reconstructs the specific vegetation of the specific landscape at the specific moment of its inundation. And then, most revolutionary of the tools now in hand, there is sedimentary ancient DNA, the extraction of genetic material from waterlogged peats and drowned soils, material that has bled from the tissues of the plants and animals that once lived on those surfaces and has been preserved, molecule by fragile molecule, in the anaerobic sediments that took them in. From a single core of North Sea peat, correctly extracted and correctly handled, researchers can now recover the genetic signature of the oaks and hazels and birches that grew there, of the red deer and the aurochs and the boar that browsed among them, of the beavers that felled the smaller trees and the otters that hunted the streams, of the fish in the paleo rivers and, in principle, of the human beings who moved through the country and left the intimate residues of their passage upon it. This is not a hypothetical technology. It is being done. The Europe's Lost Frontiers project has done it, and the demonstration that it can be done, that the systematic underwater archaeology of a submerged continental shelf is not the stuff of speculation, but an achievable, working program, is one of the quiet transformations of the discipline in our own moment. Vincent Gaffney, whose leadership of the Bradford project has done much to establish the field on its present footing, has observed that the mapping of the North Sea landscape is now possible in a way that was, only a generation ago, unimaginable, that a world hidden for millennia is being returned, painstakingly and imperfectly and in fragments, to the visible record of the human past. The seabed, once a featureless void on the archaeological maps of Europe, has become in his hands and in the hands of his collaborators an active site, mapped, sampled, modelled, interpreted. What was once a lament for what could never be known has become, gradually and with the appropriate scientific caution, a working programme for the recovery of what can. And though the greater part of the record will surely never be found, though the specific hearths of specific families and the burial places of specific dead lie, for the most part beyond the reach even of the finest of these instruments, the general shape of the Mesolithic world of the North Sea is now emerging in outline and in detail from beneath the waves. This is a present tense story. It is happening now. The next cores raised from the Brown Bank, the next sonar transects across the Dogger Bank, the next round of cedar DNA extractions from the peats of the Shotten River Channel will very likely reshape what is known about how these people lived and how their country died. The drowned world is not a closed book. It is a book being read, slowly and with difficulty, but read. And yet, and here the narration must turn, must pivot from the past into the present that surrounds the listener. The same processes that took Doggerland and Beringia and the Sunda Shelf and the drowned plains of every inhabited coast are not processes that ended with the Holocene. They slowed, they did not stop. The relative stability of sea levels over the last 6,000 years or so, the interval during which the great river valley civilizations arose, during which agriculture spread and cities were founded and writing was invented, and the recognizable geography of the modern world took shape, is not a permanent condition of the Earth. It was a pause, and in the last century, and above all in the last several decades, the pause has begun to end. Satellite altimetry, the precise measurement of the ocean surface from orbit, integrated across the whole of the world's seas, now records global mean sea level rising at a rate of approximately 3.7 to 3.8 millimeters per year. The number, taken in isolation, sounds trivial. It is not trivial. It is roughly double the rate that was measured through most of the 20th century, and the rate itself is accelerating. The trajectory is not linear but curved upward, and the curvature is being driven by the two great reservoirs of ice that remain on the Earth. The ice sheets of Greenland and of Antarctica, both of which are now losing mass at rates that were not, a generation ago, considered plausible. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its most recent assessment, projects a median rise of somewhere between 30 centimetres and 1 full metre by the year 2100, depending on the emissions pathway that the world's economies actually follow across the intervening decades. And in the tail risk scenarios, the scenarios that account for the possibility of rapid ice sheet disintegration, of processes that the models cannot yet resolve, but that the geological record suggests are physically possible, the projected rise approaches 2 metres or more within the lifetime of children now living. These are not the deep time numbers of the Pleistocene deglaciation. These are the numbers of the next several human generations, and the numbers, as always, are only the outer shell of what is happening. Within them, and beneath them, are the specific and particular coasts to which those rising waters will come. Consider the great deltas, the low, flat, immensely fertile plains where the world's largest rivers have laid down their sediments for millennia, and where, for millennia, the densest concentrations of human agriculture and settlement have gathered. The Ganges-Brahmaputra delta, spread across Bangladesh and the eastern reaches of India, is home to something on the order of 150 million people, farming rice and jute on soils that lie in many places only a few meters above the present tide line. The Mekong Delta, feeding much of Vietnam and exporting rice to a global market, is comparably low and comparably crowded. The Nile Delta, the ancient breadbasket of Egypt, and the geographic foundation of one of the oldest continuous agricultural civilizations on Earth, faces the Mediterranean along a coast that is retreating already, decade by decade, as the sea works its way inland along canals and irrigation channels and the collapsed defences of coastal lagoons. And in each of these deltas, and this is the compounding cruelty of the situation, the sea level rise is not the only pressure. The land itself is sinking. The extraction of groundwater, the compaction of unconsolidated sediments beneath the weight of cities, the reduction of the sediment supply from the rivers by the dams built upstream. All of these have combined to produce rates of land subsidence that, across large portions of these deltas, exceed the rate of the rising sea. The ground is going down while the water is coming up, and the difference between the two moves against the people who live there at a rate that is measurable, year on year, and that is beginning to reshape the maps. The human cost is being paid now. In the Mekong Delta, saltwater intrusion is reaching further inland with every dry season, poisoning wells and killing rice paddies that fed generations. In the Ganges-Brahmaputra, villages built on chars, the shifting islands of the great river system, are being lost with a frequency that traditional relocation practices can no longer accommodate, and families are moving inland into the growing peripheries of Dhaka and Kolkata, in numbers that constitute one of the largest and least discussed migrations on the planet. In the Nile Delta, the ancient towns of the coast, places whose Arabic and earlier Coptic and earlier still Greek names carry the accumulated memory of 2,000 and more years of continuous habitation, are contending with rising water tables and salinized fields. And in the Mississippi Delta, on the other side of the world and inside the wealthiest country ever to exist, the loss of coastal wetland has proceeded at a rate that has been described, memorably and terribly, as the disappearance of a football field of land every 30 minutes, a rate at which the geography of a state is being edited in real time. And beyond the deltas, in the open ocean, there are the island nations for whom this is not a question of retreat inland, because there is no inland, but a question of the survival of sovereignty itself. Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, the low atolls of the Central Pacific whose highest points stand only a few meters above the sea, are contending with a rate of loss that threatens, within decades, to render their national territories uninhabitable, and eventually to submerge them entirely. The governments of these nations have begun to consider, in ways that no modern state has previously been required to consider, what a country becomes when its land is gone, whether citizenship persists across a diaspora, whether cultural continuity can be maintained in exile, whether the ancestral villages of the reef edges will pass into the same category of drowned homeland that Doggerland now occupies. These are questions that the Mesolithic communities of the North Sea coast could not have asked in words, because the concepts of nation and sovereignty and citizenship did not exist for them. But the underlying experience, the experience of watching the sea take, generation by generation, the specific and particular ground that one's people had come to know as their own, is an experience that connects those Mesolithic coasts to these Pacific atolls across 8,000 years, and it is the experience that gives this present crisis its most difficult and most human dimension. The Doggerland story, in other words, is not merely a story about the past. It is a story that is happening again, in 100 places at once, on every inhabited coast where the tide lines are moving and the deltas are subsiding and the villages of ancestors are being surrendered to the water. The distance between the drowned world of the Mesolithic and the drowning world of the present collapses when the two are held together in the same frame into something much shorter than the 8,000 years that separates them. The mechanisms are, in their broadest terms, the same. The losses, though they play out on different timescales and against different technological and political backdrops, rhyme with one another so closely that the rhyme becomes uncomfortable. And the communities who are living the contemporary version of that story, the farmers of the Ganges chars, the fishermen of the Mekong mouths, the citizens of Tuvalu contemplating their own dispersion, carry, in the intimate and terrible knowledge that they now possess, a kind of understanding of what the last Doggerlanders knew that no archaeologist or geneticist or seismic surveyor can fully reconstruct from the outside. What does it feel like to lose a country to the sea? The question was asked, in one form or another, on every drowning coast of the Holocene transgression. It is being asked again, in new languages and against new horizons, on the coasts of the present, and it will continue to be asked, one suspects, for as long as the ice remains restless and the oceans remain hungry, which is to say, for as long as the story of the earth is still being written. And so we come back, as one always comes back in the end, to the grey water of the North Sea, and to the seabed beneath it, and to the particular emptiness of a horizon that gives away nothing of what lies below. The wind moves across the surface as it has always moved, indifferent to the hulls above and the drowned country below, carrying the salt smell inland the way it has for 8,000 years, and the trawlers push out from their harbours at Grimsby and Lowestoft and Imuiden and Esbjerg into the same working grounds that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers worked, hauling nets across a floor that is, in every meaningful sense, a graveyard. It is the largest unmarked cemetery in Europe. It is also, if one holds the thought long enough for it to settle, the largest lost country in Europe, a landmass whose extent at its greatest exceeded that of many of the modern nations that ring its former shorelines, whose forests and river valleys and coastal marshes supported human communities across dozens of generations, and whose entire cultural presence has been reduced by the patient work of the sea to a scatter of dredged bones and worked stones and the faintly readable topography of buried river channels on a seismic map. What Doggerland represents, when one steps back from the individual finds and the individual sites and the individual episodes of catastrophe, is something that the vocabulary of archaeology is not fully equipped to hold. It is the disappearance of a civilization that left no ruins. There are no temples, no city walls, no monuments, no inscriptions, no aqueducts, no citadels standing above the plain to mark where the centre of things once was. There is no Pompeii of the North Sea, no roofless amphitheatre whose seats one can walk across on a summer afternoon, no colonnade half collapsed against the sky. There is only the flat, unreadable water, and beneath it the buried remains of a landscape that was, for its inhabitants, everything. The whole of the known world, the entirety of geography, the frame within which every meaningful event of their lives took place. That world had rivers, and those rivers had names. It had hills, and those hills had names. It had places where one gathered to trade, and places where one buried the dead, and places where one did not go after nightfall. And each of these places had a name, and the names were known to everyone who lived there. And the names were passed from parents to children in the ordinary way that names are passed, and the names carried within them the memory of who had lived and died along those rivers and beneath those hills. And every one of those names is gone, not translated into another tongue, not preserved in a chronicle, not recorded in any writing anywhere, simply gone in the fullest sense that the word gone can carry, absorbed into a silence so complete that for something on the order of 10,000 years, no one on the surface of the earth even knew that the country to which the names had once belonged had ever existed. That is the true dimension of what happened here. The Storegga wave was the hinge, and it is right that the imagination should linger on the wave, because the wave is the moment in which the abstract process of drowning briefly acquired a face and a sound and a specific hour. But the wave was not, in the accounting of what was actually lost, the largest thief. The largest thief was time, and the slow rise of the sea, and the centuries of gradual retreat during which a people watched their world contract by increments too small to register within a single life, but too large to be denied across the span of 3 or 4 generations. It was in those centuries that the songs were forgotten, because the places the songs had been made to celebrate no longer existed. It was in those centuries that the sacred places were abandoned, because they were now underwater. It was in those centuries that the names of the rivers passed out of use, because the rivers themselves had merged one by one with the encroaching sea and were no longer rivers at all but arms of an ocean that had no interest in what they had once been called. And when the wave finally came, in the 62nd century before our common era, and swept across the last low islands where the last inhabitants of the drowned country were still holding on, it did not so much destroy a civilization as complete the destruction of one that had already been dying, patiently and cumulatively, for a very long time. To grasp what that means is to grasp something about the nature of loss that is not often stated plainly. When a great city falls to invasion, the invaders inherit the streets and the buildings and often the language and the gods. Something of the fallen world is carried forward into the world that succeeds it. When a plague takes a population, the villages remain and the graves remain, and the neighbouring peoples remember what was there. When a civilization is buried by ash or by desert sand, the archaeologists come, eventually, and dig it up, and the tombs give back their names and something of the vanished mind can be reconstructed from the objects it left behind. But when a country is drowned, and drowned slowly enough that its people carry away with them into inland exile, only what can be carried and then are absorbed within a few generations into the wider populations of higher ground, where their descendants forget the specific landscape from which their ancestors came. When that happens, the erasure is of a different kind. Nothing is carried forward that identifies the drowned country as a country. The genes disperse into the general gene pool of northwestern Europe. The tools blur into the general tool traditions of the Mesolithic. The stories, if any of them survived at all, mutate into flood myths so widely shared that no one can point to a particular coast as their source. The country becomes a rumour of itself, and then, in the fullness of time, not even a rumour. And that is what Doggerland became, for the 10,000 years that separated the last of its inhabitants from the first of the seismic surveys that began, at the very end of the 20th century to recover the outlines of its buried valleys from the noise of the reflected sound. And yet, and here the story turns, because a story of this weight cannot end only in absence. The sea, having taken everything, has not been able to keep everything. That is the strange consolation of a drowned world, and it is the consolation that the fishermen of the North Sea have been quietly delivering to the surface, in small handfuls, for more than a century. The trawlers, dragging their beam nets across the seabed of Brown Bank and the Lehman and Ower and the Dogger itself, have been, without meaning to be and without initially understanding what they were doing, the primary excavators of Doggerland. Their nets, designed to bring up flatfish, bring up other things as well. A mammoth molar the size of a fist, its enamel plate still clearly ridged, a section of tusk the colour of old ivory, blackened by the peat that had preserved it, the jawbone of a woolly rhinoceros, heavier than one expects a bone to be, a fragment of antler with the telltale grooves of a worked tool along its edge, a flint blade whose flaking is unmistakably the work of a human hand, a barbed point of the kind that the Mesolithic people used to fish and to hunt small game along the reedy edges of freshwater channels that no longer exist. These objects come up in the routine catch, tangled with kelp and cod, and they are set aside, usually on the deck, and examined between hauls, and often, very often, taken home to the harbour towns of the North Sea coasts, where they end up on mantelpieces and in shoeboxes under beds and behind the glass of pub display cabinets and, increasingly, in the collections of small museums whose curators have learned to welcome such visitors and to log carefully what they can from the fishermen's memories of where the catch had come from. The most famous of these accidental deliveries was the antler point, brought up by the trawler Calinda in 1931, embedded in a lump of peat dredged from the bed of the southern North Sea, the object that first suggested to a wider public that the seabed had once been dry ground walked by human beings. But for every Calinda point that has entered the scholarly record with a name attached to it, there have been thousands of quieter finds that entered private hands and stayed there, moving between generations of a family with only a vague memory attached. Grandad brought that up, off Brown Bank in the 50s, until eventually somebody thought to bring it to a museum, or to a university department, or to one of the citizen science projects that have arisen in recent years specifically to gather these dispersed fragments of a lost country into a single distributed archive. Fishermen along the Dutch coast in particular have long-standing relationships with paleontologists at Rotterdam and Leiden, delivering finds by the crate load and reporting, as best they can, the coordinates from which the finds emerged. On the English side, coastal museums at towns like Great Yarmouth and Hull, and Whitby hold, in their reserve collections, a slowly growing corpus of dredged bone and worked stone whose provenance is the water itself. Each object, taken in isolation, is a curiosity. Taken together, and mapped against the seismic topography that the paleolandscape projects have now recovered, they become something much more than that. They become the material trace of a population that was alive on the ground where the trawler nets are now dragging, and they permit the beginnings of a real archaeology of a country that no one thought could be archaeologically approached at all. The citizen science projects that have grown up around this material are worth pausing on, because they represent a way of doing the work that suits, in a quietly appropriate way, the character of the drowned landscape itself. This is a country that was inhabited not by a centralised power, leaving grand monuments, but by dispersed hunter-gatherer bands leaving small, portable, personal traces of themselves. And the recovery of those traces is being carried out, correspondingly, not by a single expedition planting a flag at a single site, but by a distributed network of amateurs and professionals and fishermen and museum staff, each contributing what they can from where they happen to be. A tooth logged in Ostend, a flint logged in Cromer, an antler tine logged in Esbjerg, a fragment of skull logged in a Dutch quayside laboratory. Each object receives, as best as memory and the trawler's chart plotter can supply, a set of coordinates, and each coordinate is added to the growing map. Slowly, over decades of quiet work of this kind, a distribution begins to emerge. Dense clusters along certain buried river channels, sparser scatter across the buried uplands, concentrations along what would once have been coastlines and estuaries. The map is coarse, and it will always be coarse, because the sea and the fishermen's memories are both imperfect witnesses, but it is a map. And when Vincent Gaffney describes what has been recovered as a completely intact landscape with a state of preservation that we can often only dream of on land, he is describing precisely this, that beneath the water, sealed under peat and marine sediment and undisturbed for 8,000 years by the ploughs and the developers and the road builders who have churned the surface archaeology of Europe into fragments, the drowned country persists, largely intact, waiting. That waiting is not passive. The seabed continues to give things back. Each storm redistributes sediment across the shallower banks, exposing new surfaces to the next season's trawlers. Each dredging operation for aggregate or for cable trenches or for wind farm foundations turns over ground that has not been turned over since the Mesolithic, and brings sometimes a fresh handful of the country up into the light. The North Sea wind industry, in particular, has become an unexpected patron of Doggerland archaeology, because the environmental assessments required for the vast offshore wind arrays being installed across the southern North Sea now routinely include seabed prehistoric survey work, and the cores drawn from the proposed turbine foundations have been yielding, in samples across the mapped landscape, ancient pollen and preserved wood and, occasionally, the unmistakable signatures of human presence. What was once the drowned country of a lost people is now becoming, incidentally, the foundation ground of a low-carbon energy future, a symmetry that would be difficult to invent and that speaks in its own way to how the past and the present continue to press against one another in this stretch of shallow sea. And yet the recovery, however patient and however skillfully organised, is a recovery only of fragments. The bones come up, and the stones come up, and the pollen comes up, and the buried channels are traced across the seismic returns, and the sum of it all is a shadow of the world that once was, an outline, filled in here and there with specific instances whose interior remains overwhelmingly blank. That blankness is not a failure of method. It is a fact about what happens when a landscape is drowned. The songs do not come up in the trawler nets. The names of the rivers do not come up. The shape of the world in the minds of the people who lived in it does not come up. What comes up is the durable material, the bone that would not rot, the flint that would not decay, the antler that the peat preserved. And from that material one reconstructs, as honestly as one can, an approximation of the life that produced it. The approximation is worth having. It is infinitely better than nothing. But it is not the country. The country is gone, and the honesty of the reconstruction lies precisely in acknowledging, at every step, how much of what was there is not, and cannot be, in what has been recovered. To hold that acknowledgement steadily, and then to lift one's eyes from the drowned country of 8,000 years ago to the drowning coasts of the present, is to arrive at the reason why the drowned continental shelves are not, in the end, a dead subject. They are a subject with direct and urgent relevance to the world that is now being made. The scientists and archaeologists and climate modelers who work on these submerged landscapes, the sedimentologists reading the cores, the geneticists reading the ancient DNA extracted from the mud, the tsunami modelers reading the run-up deposits, the paleoclimatologists reading the pollen and the isotopes, are increasingly explicit that the utility of this work extends far beyond antiquarian interest. The drowned shelves are a calibration dataset. They record, at high resolution and across many different geographies, how sea level has actually behaved during periods of rapid warming, how coastlines have actually retreated, how estuaries have actually migrated inland, how sediment budgets have actually responded to shifting shorelines. Every model of the future coast draws, whether its authors say so explicitly or not, on the empirical record of the past coast, and the past coast is very largely underwater, and it is the recovery of the past coast that gives the models their teeth. The Doggerlands and Sunderlands and Beringias of the world are, in this sense, laboratories in which the same experiment that is now being run on the modern coastlines has already been run to completion, and the results are lying there on the seabed for anyone patient enough to read them. But the calibration data is only the technical part of what these landscapes offer. There is a second kind of data which is not measurable in the same way and yet is no less real. The cultural data, the record of how communities coped, or failed to cope, with the loss of coastal ground. The Mesolithic peoples of the North Sea coast did not leave written accounts of what it was like to abandon a village to the encroaching marsh, or to bury a grandmother on ground that would be underwater within a generation, or to negotiate with the inland communities into whose territory one was moving because one's own territory no longer existed. But they left the movements themselves, traceable now in the shifting distributions of tools and burials and settlements, along the coasts of Britain and the Netherlands and Denmark during the millennia of the drowning. Those movements are, in their broadest patterns, the record of a human response to precisely the kind of loss that is now being asked of the delta populations of Bangladesh and Vietnam and Egypt and the low island nations of the Pacific. What the past offers on this front is not a prescription. The political and technological conditions are wholly different, and no ancient parallel maps cleanly onto a modern crisis. But it offers a frame within which to think about the modern crisis with a longer view, and a recognition that this is not the first time in human history that the sea has taken a homeland, and that the ways in which the taking is registered and mourned and eventually integrated into the life of the successor communities are questions of very deep antiquity indeed. And beneath the calibration data and the cultural data, there is a third thing, harder to name and yet perhaps the most important, which is the moral reckoning with impermanence that the drowned shelves press upon anyone who spends time with them. To sit with the fact of Doggerland is to sit with the fact that a landscape can be, for the people who inhabit it, the whole and unquestioned frame of their existence, and can then simply cease to be. The ground is not eternal, the coast is not eternal, the homeland is not eternal. These are things that every culture at some level has always known, and yet things that every culture, in the practical conduct of its daily life, tends to forget. The drowned shelves are the great physical reminder that the forgetting is a luxury of favourable circumstances, and that the circumstances have changed before and are changing again. What Vincent Gaffney has called the intricate minuet with an ocean lapping at their doorsteps. The choreography of adjustment and retreat and reoccupation that the Mesolithic communities of the North Sea coast performed for centuries is a minuet whose steps are now being taught, unwillingly, to the coastal populations of the 21st century. The teachers are the same as they were then: the tide, the storm, the delta losing its sediment, the ice sheet in the distance losing its mass. The dancers are new, but the dance is old, and so, at the end, the North Sea at night. The wind still moves across the surface as it has always moved. The trawlers are out, or in, depending on the season and the weather, their lights small and separate against the great dark of the water. Beneath their keels, at depths of 16 to 30 metres in some places and considerably more in others, lies the buried landscape, the Shotten River running its long-forgotten course through its long-forgotten valley, the wooded hills flattened now under marine mud, the coastal marshes where the wave came in, and the peat where the antler point rested for 8,000 years, until a Lowestoft skipper dragged it into the light. There are no lights down there. There is no sound down there that a diver would recognise as anything but the ordinary sound of a shallow sea. There is only the shape of a country under the sediment, and the memory of it gradually and patiently reassembled by seismic returns and dredged bones and citizen catalogues, and the quiet, cumulative work of the people who have taken the country's recovery on as a task. Doggerland was a real place. Real people were born there and grew up there and grew old there and were buried there. They had names, and they had a language in which those names had meanings, and they had a sense of who they were that was inseparable from the specific rivers and hills and estuaries and forests among which they lived their lives. All of that is gone. It is gone in the fullest and most complete sense that anything can be gone, and no future recovery, however skilled, will ever bring back more than a shadow of it. The sea took it, and the sea is rising again, and other Doggerlands are forming now beneath the feet of the living. That is the story. That is the whole of the story. The featureless water above a landscape that was once everything to someone. The wind that does not remember. The tide that does not stop coming in. And somewhere out there tonight, on a boat whose skipper is thinking about tomorrow's catch and not about the 8,000 years of silence beneath his hull, a beam trawl is being winched back aboard, and among the flatfish and the weed there is a small heavy object with the unmistakable weight and colour of very old bone. He will set it aside. He will look at it later in the light of the wheelhouse, and whatever he decides to do with it, take it home, hand it to a museum, drop it back over the side. The drowned country will have given up once again one more small fragment of itself into the world above the water, and the long, patient work of remembering what cannot be fully remembered will have gone on for one more night on the surface of a sea that was once a country, and that will one day, in ways we do not yet fully understand, be a country again for someone else, when the ice moves and the shorelines move, and the story of the earth turns once more onto its next unwritten page.